Hello. It has been a while, at least for the reading aspect. I'm really enjoying the flying stuff. The technical manual is even, but I always need a little bit of fiction in my life. So we're going to get back to that and we're going to finish tonight, hopefully. So I'll just make sure everything's working and we will get started immediately. Bada boom. All right. Audio's working. Make sure this works. Boom. Okay. Yes. Should be good. Okie dokie. Here we go. Our first of the final is Melonta Tauta, which I looked up and is Greek for these things are in the future. So, as it says there, on board balloon Skylark, April 1st, 2848. It is set in the future, 1,000 years from when it was written. And it is basically a pretentious woman on board a hot air balloon sending letters to a friend and getting everything wrong about history. So that should be interesting. And I'm looking forward to it. Again, forgive me, it's been a while. So, Melon Tatauta, on board balloon Skylark, April 1st, 2848. Now, my dear friend, now, for your sins, you are to suffer the infliction of a long, gossiping letter. I tell you distinctly that I am going to punish you for all your impertinences by being as tedious, as discursive, as incoherent, and as unsatisfactory as possible. Besides, here I am cooped up in a dirty balloon with some 100 or 200 of the canaille, all bound on a pleasure excursion. What a funny idea some people have of pleasure. And I have no prospect of touching terra firma for a month at least. Nobody to talk to, nothing to do. When one has nothing to do, then is the time to correspond with one's friends. You perceive, then, why it is that I write you this letter. It is on account of my ennui and your sins. Get ready your spectacles and make up your mind to be annoyed. I mean to write at you every day during this odious voyage. Hey-oh, hey-ho. When will any invention visit the human pericranium? Are we forever to be doomed to the 1,000 inconveniences of the balloon? Will nobody contrive a more expeditious mode of progress? This jog-trot movement, to my thinking, is little less than positive torture. Upon my word, we have not made more than 100 miles the hour since leaving home. The very birds beat us, at least some of them. I assure you that I do not exaggerate at all. Our motion, no doubt, seems slower than it actually is. This on account of our having no objects about us by which to estimate our velocity, and on account of our going with the wind. To be sure, whenever we meet a balloon, we have a chance of perceiving our rate, and then, I admit, things do not appear so very bad. Accustomed as I am to this mode of traveling, I cannot get over a kind of giddiness whenever a balloon passes us in a current directly overhead. It always seems to me like an immense bird of prey about to pounce upon us and carry us off in its claws. One went over us this morning about sunrise, and so nearly overhead that its drag rope actually brushed the network suspending our car and caused us very serious apprehension. Keep forgetting this is over. Apprehension. Our captain said that if the material of the bag had been the trumpery varnished silk of 500 or 1,000 years ago, we should inevitably have been damaged. This silk, as he explained it to me, was a fabric composed of the entrails of a species of earthworm. The worm was carefully fed on mulberries, a kind of fruit resembling a watermelon, and when sufficiently fat, was crushed in a mill. The paste thus arising was called papyrus in its primary state, and went through a variety of processes until it finally became silk. Singular to relate, it was once much admired as an article of female dress. Balloons were also very generally constructed from it. A better kind of material, it appears, was subsequently found in the down surrounding the seed vessels of a plant vulgarly called euphorbium, and at that time botanically termed milkweed. This latter kind of silk was designated as silk Buckingham on account of its superior durability, and was usually prepared for use by being varnished with a solution of gum caoutchouc. Bless me. Caoutchouc, a natural rubber that has not been vulcanized. Caoutchouc, gum caoutchouc, a substance which in some respects must have resembled the gutta percha now in common use. This caoutchouc was occasionally called India rubber or rubber of whist, and was no doubt one of the numerous fungi. Never tell me again that I am not at heart an antiquarian. Talking of drag ropes, our own, it seems, has this moment knocked a man overboard from one of the small magnetic propellers that swarm in ocean below us. A boat of about 6,000 tons and, from all accounts, shamefully crowded. These diminutive barks should be prohibited from carrying more than a definite number of passengers. The man, of course, was not permitted to get on board again, and was soon out of sight, he and his life preserver. I rejoice, my dear friend, that we live in an age so enlightened that no such a thing as an individual is supposed to exist. It is the mass for which the true humanity cares. By the by, talking of humanity, do you know that our immortal Wiggins is not so original in his views of the social condition and so forth as his contemporaries are inclined to suppose? Pundit assures me that the same ideas were put, nearly in the same way, about 1,000 years ago by an Irish philosopher called Furrier, on account of his keeping a retail shop for cat peltries and other furs. Pundit knows, you know, there can be no mistake about it. How very wonderfully do we see verified every day the profound observation of the Hindu Aristotle, as quoted by Pundit. Thus must we say that not once or twice or a few times, but with almost infinite repetitions, the same opinions come round in a circle among men. And I will understand some of the references, not all of them. April 2nd, spoke today the magnetic cutter in charge of the middle section of floating telegraph wires. I learned that when this species of telegraph was first put into operation by horse, it was considered quite impossible to convey the wires over sea. But now we are at a loss to comprehend where the difficulty lay. So wags the world. Tempora mutantur. Excuse me for quoting the Etruscan. What would we do without the Atlantic telegraph? Pundit says Atlantic. When I was reading it before, I think it said Atalantic. Atlantic telegraph. Pundit says Atlantic was the ancient adjective. We lay to a few minutes to ask the cutter some questions and learned, among other glorious news, that civil war is raging in Africa, while the plague is doing its good work beautifully both in Europe and Asia. Is it not truly remarkable that before the magnificent light shed upon philosophy by humanity, the world was accustomed to regard war and pestilence as calamities? Do you know that prayers were actually offered up in the ancient temples to the end that these evils might not be visited upon mankind? Is it not really difficult to comprehend upon what principle of interest our forefathers acted? Were they so blind as not to perceive that the destruction of a myriad of individuals is only so much positive advantage to the mass? April 3rd. It is really a very fine amusement to ascend the rope ladder leading to the summit of the balloon bag and thence survey the surrounding world. From the car below, you know, the prospect is not so comprehensive. You can see little vertically, but seated here, where I write this, in the luxuriously cushioned open piazza of the summit, one can see everything that is going on in all directions. Just now there is quite a crowd of balloons in sight, and they present a very animated appearance, while the air is resonant with the hum of so many millions of human voices. I have heard it asserted that when yellow, or as pundit will have it, Violet, who is supposed to have been the first aeronaut, maintained the practicability of traversing the atmosphere in all directions by merely ascending or descending until a favorable current was attained. He was scarcely hearkened to at all by his contemporaries, who looked upon him as merely an ingenious sort of madman because the philosophers of the day declared the thing impossible. Really, now, it does seem to me quite unaccountable now how anything so obviously feasible could have escaped the sagacity of the ancient savants. But in all ages, the great obstacles to advancement in art have been opposed by the so called men of science. To be sure, our men of science are not quite so bigoted as those of old. Oh, I have something so queer to tell you on this topic. Do you know that it is not more than 1,000 years ago since the metaphysicians consented to relieve the people of the singular fancy that there existed but two possible roads for the attainment of truth? Believe it if you can. It appears that long, long ago, in the night of time, there lived a Turkish philosopher, or Hindu possibly, called Aristotle. This person introduced, or at all events propagated, what was termed the deductive or a priori mode of investigation. He started with what he maintained to be axioms or self evident truths, and thence proceeded logically to results. His greatest disciples were one Euclid and one Kant. Well, Aristotle flourished supreme until the advent of one Hogg, surnamed the Ettrick Shepherd, who preached an entirely different system, which he called the a posteriori or inductive. His plan referred altogether to sensation. He proceeded by observing, analyzing, and classifying facts instantiae naturae, I never know how to pronounce that, as they were affectedly called into general laws. Aristotle's mode, in a word, was based on noumena, Hogg's on phenomena. Well, so great was the admiration excited by this latter system that, at its first introduction, Aristotle fell into disrepute, but finally he recovered ground and was permitted to divide the realm of truth with his more modern rival. The savants now maintained that Aristotelian and Baconian roads were the sole possible avenues to knowledge. Baconian, you must know, was an adjective invented as equivalent to Hoggian and more euphonious and dignified. Now, my dear friend, I do assure you most positively that I represent this matter fairly, on the soundest authority, and you can easily understand how a notion so absurd on its very face must have operated to retard the progress of all true knowledge, which makes its advances almost invariably by intuitive bounds. The ancient idea confined investigation to crawling, and for hundreds of years so great was the infatuation about Hogg especially, that a virtual end was put to all thinking properly so called. No man dared utter a truth to which he felt himself indebted to his soul alone. It mattered not whether the truth was even demonstrably a truth, for the bullet-headed savants of the time regarded only the road by which he had attained it. They would not even look at the end. Let us see the means, they cried, the means. If, upon investigation of the means, it was found to come neither under the category Aries, that is to say ram, nor under the category Hog, why then the savants went no farther, but pronounced the theorist a fool, and would have nothing to do with him or his truth. Now it cannot be maintained, even, that by the crawling system the greatest amount of truth would be attained in any long series of ages, for the repression of imagination was an evil not to be compensated for by any superior certainty in the ancient modes of investigation. The error of these Germans, these French, these English, and these Americans, the latter, by the way, were our own immediate progenitors, was an error quite analogous with that of the wiseacre who fancies that he must necessarily see an object the better the more closely he holds it to his eyes. These people blinded themselves by details. When they proceeded hoggishly, their facts were by no means always facts, a matter of little consequence had it not been for assuming that they were facts, and must be facts because they appear to be such. When they proceeded on the path of the ram, their course was scarcely as straight as a ram's horn, for they never had an axiom which was an axiom at all. They must have been very blind not to see this, even in their own day, for even in their own day many of the long-established axioms had been rejected. For example, ex nihilo nihil fit. So from nothing, nothing is done. For example, from nothing, nothing is done. A body cannot act where it is not. Oh, there it is. There cannot exist antipodes. Come back. Nope. Antipodes. Well, hello! We're doing reading today. She's in a hot air balloon, so it's something to do with flight. So she is. She's in the future, and she's getting everything wrong about history. A lot of philosophy. And yes, yes. Um, Aristotle is Aries Toddle. Americans, Germans, the French. Yeah, it's quite interesting. So for example, now I've lost it. From nothing, nothing is done to. So a body cannot act where it is not. There cannot exist antipodes. Darkness cannot come out of light. All these and a dozen other similar propositions, formerly admitted without hesitation as axioms, were, even at the period of which I speak, seen to be untenable. How absurd in these people, then, to persist in putting faith in axioms as immutable bases of truth. But even out of the mouths of their soundest reasoners, it is easy to demonstrate the futility, the impalpability of their axioms in general. Who was the soundest of their logicians? Let me see. I will go and ask Pundit and be back in a minute. Here we have it. Here is a book written nearly 1,000 years ago and lately translated from English, which, by the way, appears to have been the rudiment of the American. Pundit says it is decidedly the cleverest ancient work on its topic, logic. The author, who was much thought of in his day, was one Miller, or Mill, and we find it recorded of him as a point of some importance that he had a mill horse called Bentham. But let us glance at the treatise. Sounds good. I will add that to the list. Next will be Shakespeare. That was suggested to me a while ago when I thought I was almost done with Poe. And yes, but at some point I'll get to that. I'll write it down right now so that I do not forget. Da, 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 da. Perfect. Sounds good. Good. All right. And I'm trying to do like the classics and stuff like that just because then it's all free. And I don't have to worry about copyright or anything. So, yeah. Ability or inability to conceive, says Mr. Mill. Yes, absolutely. I'm glad that you're interested. Not everybody's interested in this sort of thing. So I do. I like it when people are. So, yes. Ability or inability to conceive, says Mr. Mill, very properly, is in no case to be received as a criterion of axiomatic truth. What modern in his senses would ever think of disputing this truism? The only wonder with us must be how it happened that Mr. Mill conceived it necessary even to hint at anything so obvious. So far good, but let us turn over another page. What have we here? Contradictories cannot both be true, that is, cannot coexist in nature. Here, Mr. Mill means, for example, that a tree must be either a tree or not a tree, that it cannot be at the same time a tree and not a tree. Very well, but I ask him why. His reply is this, and never pretends to be anything else than this, because it is impossible to conceive that contradictories can both be true. But this is no answer at all by his own showing, for has he not just admitted as a truism that... Whoop. Oh, good Lord. Sometimes I have issues. There we go. Ability or inability to conceive is in no case to be received as a criterion of axiomatic truth. Now, I do not complain of these ancients so much because their logic is, by their own showing, utterly baseless, worthless, and fantastic altogether, as because of their pompous and imbecile proscription of all other roads of truth, of all other means for its attainment, than the two preposterous paths, the one of creeping and the one of crawling, to which they have dared to confine the soul that loves nothing so well as to soar. By the by, my dear friend, do you not think it would have puzzled these It would have puzzled these ancient dogmaticians to have determined by which of their two roads it was that the most important and most sublime of all their truths was, in effect, attained? I mean the truth of gravitation. Newton owed it to Kepler. Kepler admitted that his 3 laws were guessed at. These 3 laws of all laws, which led the great English mathematician to his principle, the basis of all physical principle, to go behind which we must enter the kingdom of metaphysics. Kepler guessed, that is to say, imagined. He was essentially a theorist, that word now of so much sanctity, formerly an epithet of contempt. Would it not have puzzled these old moles, too, to have explained by which of the 2 roads a cryptographist unriddles a cryptograph of more than usual secrecy, or by which of the 2 roads Champollion directed mankind to those enduring and almost innumerable truths which resulted from his deciphering the hieroglyphics? One word more on this topic, and I will be done boring you. Is it not passing strange that, with their eternal prating about roads to truth, these bigoted people missed what we now so clearly perceive to be the great highway, that of consistency? Does it not seem singular how they should have failed to deduce from the works of God the vital fact that a perfect consistency must be an absolute truth? How plain has been our progress since the late announcement of this proposition! Investigation has been taken out of the hands of the ground moles and given as a task to the true and only true thinkers, the men of ardent imagination. These latter theorize. Can you not fancy the shout of scorn with which my words would be received by our progenitors were it possible for them to be now looking over my shoulder? These men, I say, theorize, and their theories are simply corrected, reduced, systematized, cleared little by little of their dross of inconsistency, until finally a perfect consistency stands apparent, which even the most stolid admit, because it is a consistency, to be an absolute and an unquestionable truth. April 4th. The new gas is doing wonders, in conjunction with the new improvement with gutta percha. How very safe, commodious, manageable, and in every respect convenient are our modern balloons. Here is an immense one approaching us at the rate of at least 150 miles an hour. It seems to be crowded with people. Perhaps there are 300 or 400 passengers, and yet it soars to an elevation of nearly a mile, looking down upon poor us with sovereign contempt. Still, 100 or even 200 miles an hour is slow traveling after all. Do you remember our flight on the railroad across the Canada continent? Fully 300 miles the hour. That was traveling. Nothing to be seen, though. Nothing to be done but flirt, feast, and dance in the magnificent saloons. Do you remember what an odd sensation was experienced when, by chance, we caught a glimpse of external objects while the cars were in full flight? Everything seemed unique, in one mass. For my part, I cannot say but that I preferred the traveling by the slow train of 100 miles the hour. Here we were permitted to have glass windows, even to have them open, and something like a distinct view of the country was attainable. Pundit says that the route for the great Canada Railroad must have been in some measure marked out about 900 years ago. In fact, he goes so far as to assert that actual traces of a road are still discernible, traces referable to a period quite as remote as that mentioned. The track, it appears, was double only. Ours, you know, has 12 paths, and 3 or 4 new ones are in preparation. The ancient rails were very slight and placed so close together as to be, according to modern notions, quite frivolous, if not dangerous in the extreme. The present width of track, 50 feet, is considered, indeed, scarcely secure enough. For my part, I make no doubt that a track of some sort must have existed in very remote times, as Pundit asserts, for nothing can be clearer, to my mind, than that at some period, not less than 7 centuries ago, certainly, the northern and southern Canada continents were united. The Canadians, then, would have been driven by necessity to a great railroad across the continent. April 5th. I am almost devoured by ennui. Pundit is the only conversable person on board, and he, poor soul, can speak of nothing but antiquities. He has been occupied all the day in the attempt to convince me that the ancient Amricans governed themselves. Did ever anybody hear of such an absurdity? That they existed in a sort of every man for himself confederacy, after the fashion of the prairie dogs that we read of in fable. He says that they started with the queerest idea conceivable, viz., that all men are born free and equal, this in the very teeth of the laws of gradation, so visibly impressed upon all things both in the moral and physical universe. Every man voted, as they called it, that is to say, meddled with public affairs, until at length it was discovered that what is everybody's business is nobody's, and that the Republic, so the absurd thing was called, was without a government at all. It is related, however, that the first circumstance which disturbed, very particularly, the self-complacency of the philosophers who constructed this republic was the startling discovery that universal suffrage gave opportunity for fraudulent schemes, by means of which any desired number of votes might at any time be polled, without the possibility of prevention, or even detection, by any party which should be merely villainous enough not to be ashamed of the fraud. A little reflection upon this discovery sufficed to render evident the consequences, which were that rascality must predominate. In a word, that a republican government could never be anything but a rascally one. While the philosophers, however, were busied in blushing at their stupidity in not having foreseen these inevitable evils, and intent upon the invention of new theories, the matter was put to an abrupt issue by a fellow of the name of Mob, who took who took everything into his own hands and set up a despotism, in comparison with which those of the fabulous Zeros and Heliophagabalises were respectable and delectable. This Mob, a foreigner by the by, is said to have been the most odious of all men that ever encumbered the earth. He was a giant in stature, insolent, rapacious, filthy, had the gall of a bullock, with the heart of a hyena and the brains of a peacock. He died at length by dint of his own energies, which exhausted him. Nevertheless, he had his uses, as everything has, however vile, and taught mankind a lesson which to this day it is in no danger of forgetting: never to run directly contrary to the natural analogies. As for republicanism, no analogy could be found for it upon the face of the earth, unless we accept the case of the prairie dogs, an exception which seems to demonstrate, if anything, that democracy is a very admirable form of government for dogs. Whoa! April 6th. Last night had a fine view of Alpha Lyrae, whose disk, through our captain's spyglass, subtends an angle of half a degree, looking very much as our sun does to the naked eye on a misty day. Alpha Lyrae, although so very much larger than our sun, by the by, resembles him closely as regards its spots, its atmosphere, and in many other particulars. It is only within the last century, pundit tells me, that the binary relation existing between these two orbs began even to be suspected. The evident motion of our system in the heavens was, strange to say, referred to an orbit about a prodigious star in the center of the galaxy. About this star, or at all events, about a center of gravity common to all the globes of the Milky Way, and supposed to be near Alcyone in the Pleiades, every one of these globes was declared to be revolving, our own performing the circuit in a period of 117 million of years. We, with our present lights, our vast telescopic improvements, and so forth, of course find it difficult to comprehend the ground of an idea such as this. Its first propagator was one Muddler. He was led, we must presume, to this wild hypothesis by mere analogy in the first instance, but this being the case, he should have at least adhered to analogy in its development. A great central orb was, in fact, suggested. So far, Muddler was consistent. This central orb, however, dynamically, should have been greater than all its surrounding orbs taken together. The question might then have been asked, why do we not see it? We, especially, who occupy the mid-region of the cluster, the very locality near which, at least, must be situated this inconceivable central sun. The astronomer perhaps at this point took refuge in the suggestion of non-luminosity, and here analogy was suddenly let fall. But even admitting the central orb non-luminous, how did he manage to explain its failure to be rendered visible by the incalculable host of glorious suns glaring in all directions about it? No doubt what he finally maintained was merely a center of gravity common to all the revolving orbs, but here again analogy must have been let fall. Our system revolves, it is true, about a common center of gravity, but it does this in connection with and in consequence of a material sun, whose mass more than counterbalances the rest of the system. The mathematical circle is a curve composed of an infinity of straight lines, but this idea of the circle, this idea of it, which, in regard to all earthly geometry, we consider as merely the mathematical, in contradistinction from the practical idea, is, in sober fact, the practical conception which alone we have any right to entertain in respect to those titanic circles with which we have to deal, at least in fancy, when we suppose our system, with its fellows, revolving about a point in the center of the galaxy. Let the most vigorous of human imaginations but attempt to take a single step towards the comprehension of a circuit so unutterable. It would scarcely be paradoxical to say that a flash of lightning itself, traveling forever upon the circumference of this inconceivable circle, would still forever be traveling in a straight line, that the path of our sun along such a circumference, that the direction of our system in such an orbit would, to any human perception, deviate in the slightest degree from a straight line even in 1,000,000 of years, is a proposition not to be entertained. And yet these ancient astronomers were absolutely cajoled, it appears, into believing that a decisive curvature had become apparent during the brief period of their astronomical history, during the mere point, during the utter nothingness of 2,000 or 3,000 years. How incomprehensible that considerations such as this did not at once indicate to them the true state of affairs, that of the binary revolution of our sun and Alpha Lyrae around a common center of gravity. April 7th. Continued last night our astronomical amusements. Eh. Had a fine view of the 5 Neptunian asteroids and watched with much interest the putting up of a huge impost on a couple of lintels in the new temple of Daphnis in the moon. It was amusing to think that creatures so diminutive as the Lunarians, and bearing so little resemblance to humanity, yet evinced a mechanical ingenuity so much superior to our own. One finds it difficult, too, to conceive the vast masses which these people handle so easily, to be as light as our reason tells us they actually are. April 8th. Eureka! Pundit is in his glory. A balloon from Canada spoke us today and threw on board several late papers. They contain some exceedingly curious information relative to Canadian, or rather to American, antiquities. You know, I presume, that laborers have for some months been employed in preparing the ground for a new fountain at Paradise, the Emperor's principal pleasure garden. Paradise, it appears, has been, literally speaking, an island time out of mind. That is to say, its northern boundary was always, as far back as any records extend, a rivulet, or rather a very narrow arm of the sea. This arm was gradually widened until it attained its present breadth, a mile. The whole length of the island is 9 miles. The breadth varies materially. The entire area, so pundit says, was about 800 years ago, densely packed with houses, some of them 20 stories high. Land, for some most unaccountable reason, being considered as especially precious just in this vicinity. The disastrous earthquake, however, of the year 2050 so totally uprooted and overwhelmed the town, for it was almost too large to be called a village, that the most indefatigable of our antiquarians have never yet been able to obtain from the site any sufficient data, in the shape of coins, medals, or inscriptions, wherewith to build up even the ghost of a theory concerning the manners, customs, etc., 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 of the aboriginal inhabitants. Nearly all that we have hitherto known of them is that they were a portion of the Knickerbocker tribe of savages infesting the continent at its first discovery by Recorder Riker, a knight of the Golden Fleece. They were by no means uncivilized, however, but cultivated various arts and even sciences after a fashion of their own. It is related of them that they were acute in many respects, but were oddly afflicted with a monomania for building what, in the ancient American, was denominated churches, a kind of pagoda instituted for the worship of 2 idols that went by the names of Wealth and Fashion. In the end, it is said, the island became 9/10 of it church. The women, too, it appears, were oddly deformed by a natural protuberance of the region just below the small of the back, although most unaccountably this deformity was looked upon altogether in the light of a beauty. 1 or 2 pictures of this singular women have, in fact, been miraculously preserved. They look very odd, very, like something between a turkey cock and a dromedary. Well, these few details are nearly all that have descended to us respecting the ancient Knickerbockers. It seems, however, that while digging in the center of the Emperor's garden, which you know covers the whole island, some of the workmen unearthed a cubical and evidently chiseled block of granite weighing several hundred pounds. It was in good preservation, having received, apparently, little injury from the convulsion which entombed it. On one of its surfaces was a marble slab with, only think of it, an inscription, a legible inscription. Pundit is in ecstasies. Upon detaching the slab, a cavity appeared containing a leaden box filled with various coins, a long scroll of names, several documents which appeared to resemble newspapers, with other matters of intense interest to the antiquarian. There can be no doubt that all these are genuine American relics belonging to the tribe called Knickerbocker. The papers thrown on board our balloon are filled with facsimiles of the coins, manuscripts, typography, etc., etc. I copy for your amusement the Knickerbocker inscription on the marble slab. This cornerstone of a monument to the memory of George Washington was laid with appropriate ceremonies on the 19th day of October, 1847, the anniversary of the surrender of Lord Cornwallis to General Washington at Yorktown, A.D. 1781, under the auspices of the Washington Monument Association of the City of New York. This, as I give it, is a verbatim translation done by Pundit himself, so there can be no mistake about it. From the few words thus preserved, we glean several important items of knowledge, not the least interesting of which is the fact that 1,000 years ago, actual monuments had fallen into disuse, as was all very proper, the people contenting themselves, as we do now, with a mere indication of the design to erect a monument at some future time, a cornerstone being cautiously laid by itself solitary and alone, excuse me for quoting the great American poet Benton, as a guarantee of the magnanimous intention, We ascertain, too, very distinctly, from this admirable inscription, the how, as well as the where and the what, of the great surrender in question. As to the where, it was Yorktown, wherever that was, and as to the what, it was General Cornwallis, no doubt some wealthy dealer in corn. He was surrendered. The inscription commemorates the surrender of what? Why, of Lord Cornwallis. The only question is, what could the savages wish him surrendered for? But when we remember that these savages were undoubtedly cannibals, we are led to the conclusion that they intended him for sausage. As to the how of the surrender, no language can be more explicit. Lord Cornwallis was surrendered for sausage, under the auspices of the Washington Monument Association, no doubt a charitable institution for the depositing of cornerstones. But heaven bless me, what is the matter? Ah, I see. The balloon has collapsed, and we shall have a tumble into the sea. I have, therefore, only time enough to add that, from a hasty inspection of the facsimiles of the newspapers, etc., etc., I find that the great men in those days, among the Americans, were one John, a smith, and one Zachary, a tailor. Goodbye until I see you again. Whether you ever get this letter or not is a point of little importance, as I write altogether for my own amusement. I shall cork the manuscript up in a bottle, however, and throw it into the sea. Yours everlastingly, Pundita. So that was a roller coaster. It was a lot more technical than I was expecting it to be. I was thinking it was going to be a little bit more of the fiction-y of it. I still enjoyed it. It was. I liked all of the Americans, the Germans, the Zachary a Taylor, all of that. But it was a little heavy for this medium, I guess. But I enjoyed it. It was fun, and it's interesting to consider how even the things that we look back on, how we perceive that now, and how it probably wasn't the same as that. Our perceptions are different than what it actually was. Perhaps not that different, but you never know. So this next one I do believe is a more humorous one. So, loss of breath, a tale neither in nor out of Blackwood. Oh, breathe not, etc. Moore's Melodies. The most notorious ill fortune must in the end yield to the untiring courage of philosophy, as the most stubborn city to the ceaseless vigilance of an enemy. Salmaneser, as we have it in the holy writings, lay 3 years before Samaria, yet it fell. Sardanapalus, see Diodorus, maintained himself seven in Nineveh, but to no purpose. Troy expired at the close of the second lustrum, and Azoth, as Aristeus declares upon his honor as a gentleman, opened at last her gates to Sammaticus, after having barred them for the 5th part of a century. I feel like is there a star there? Maybe at the end. Thou wretch, thou vixen, thou shrew, said I to my wife on the morning after our wedding. Thou witch, thou hag, thou whipper-snapper, thou sink of iniquity, thou fiery-faced quintessence of all that is abominable. Those are good ones to remember. Give it back. I need the insults. Oh, come on. They must be memorized. Aha. That is abominable. Thou, here standing upon tiptoe, seizing her by the throat and placing my mouth close to her ear, I was preparing to launch forth a new and more decided epithet of opprobrium, which should not fail, if ejaculated, to convince her of her insignificance, when to my extreme horror and astonishment, I discovered that I had lost my breath. The phrases "I am out of breath," "I have lost my breath," etc., are often enough repeated in common conversation, but it had never occurred to me that the terrible accident of which I speak could bona fide and actually happen. Imagine, that is, if you have a fanciful turn, imagine, I say, my wonder, my consternation, my despair. There is a good genius, however, which has never entirely deserted me. In my most ungovernable moods, I still retain a sense of propriety, and the something of passions that drive me, and the control, maybe, of passions that drive me. Will you let me? Good Lord. Technical difficulties. One moment, please. There. Okay. In my most ungovernable moods, I still retain a sense of propriety, and the path of passions leads me, as Lord Edward in the Julie says it did him, to true philosophy. Although I could not at first precisely ascertain to what degree the occurrence had affected me, I determined at all events to conceal the matter from my wife, until further experience should discover to me the extent of this my unheard of calamity. Altering my countenance, therefore, in a moment, from its bepuffed and distorted appearance to an expression of arch and coquettish benignity, I gave my lady a pat on the one cheek and a kiss on the other, and without saying one syllable, furies I could not, left her astonished at my drollery, as I pirouetted out of the room in a pas de zephyr. Behold me then safely ensconced in my private boudoir, a fearful instance of the ill consequences attending upon irascibility, alive with the qualifications of the dead, dead with the propensities of the living, an anomaly on the face of the earth, being very calm, yet breathless. Yes, breathless. I am serious in asserting that my breath was entirely gone. I could not have stirred with it a feather if my life had been at issue, or sullied even the delicacy of a mirror. Hard fate, yet there was some alleviation to the first overwhelming paroxysm of my sorrow. I found upon trial that the powers of utterance which, upon my inability to proceed in the conversation with my wife, I then concluded to be totally destroyed, were in fact only partially impeded, and I discovered that had I at that interesting crisis dropped my voice to a singularly deep guttural, I might still have continued to her the communication of my sentiments. This pitch of voice, the guttural, depending, I find, not upon the current of the breath, but upon a certain spasmodic action of the muscles of the throat. Throwing myself upon a chair, I remained for some time absorbed in meditation. My reflections, be sure, were of no consolatory kind. 1,000 vague and lachrymatory fancies took possession of my soul, and even the idea of suicide flitted across my brain. But it is a trait in the perversity of human nature to reject the obvious and the ready for the far distant and equivocal. Thus I shuddered at self-murder as the most decided of atrocities, while the tabby cat purred strenuously upon the rug, and the very water dog wheezed assiduously under the table, each taking to itself much merit for the strength of its lungs, and all obviously done in derision of my own pulmonary incapacity. Oppressed with a tumult of vague hopes and fears, I at length heard the footsteps of my wife descending the staircase. Being now assured of her absence, I returned with a palpitating heart to the scene of my disaster. Carefully locking the door on the inside, I commenced a vigorous search. It was possible, I thought, that concealed in some obscure corner or lurking in some closet or drawer might be found the lost object of my inquiry. It might have a vapory, it might even have a tangible form. Most philosophers upon many points of philosophy are still very unphilosophical. William Godwin, however, says in his Mandeville that invisible things are the only realities, and this all will allow is a case in point. I would have the judicious reader pause before accusing such asseverations of an undue quantum of absurdity. Anaxagoras, it will be remembered, maintained that snow is black, and this I have since found to be the case. Long and earnestly did I continue the investigation, but the contemptible reward of my industry and perseverance proved to be only a set of false teeth, 2 pair of hips, an eye, and a bundle of billets doux. Isn't that 12 tickets? Or 2 tickets? Soft tickets. From Mr. Windenow to my wife. I might as well here observe that this confirmation of my lady's partiality for Mr. W. occasioned me a little uneasiness. That Mrs. Lackabreath should admire anything so dissimilar to myself was a natural and necessary evil. I am, it is well known, of a robust and corpulent appearance, and at the same time somewhat diminutive in stature. What wonder, then, that the lath-like tenuity of my acquaintance and his altitude, which has grown into a proverb, should have met with all due estimation in the eyes of Mrs. Lackabreath. But to return. My exertions, as I have before said, proved fruitless. Closet after closet, drawer after drawer, corner after corner, were scrutinized to no purpose. At one time, however, I thought myself sure of my prize, having, in rummaging a dressing case, accidentally demolished a bottle of Grandjean's oil of archangels, which, as an agreeable perfume, I here take the liberty of recommending. With a heavy heart, I returned to my boudoir, there to ponder upon some method of eluding my wife's penetration, until I could make arrangements prior to my leaving the country, for to this I had already made up my mind. In a foreign climate being unknown, I might, with some probability of success, endeavor to conceal my unhappy calamity, a calamity calculated, even more than beggary, to estrange the affections of the multitude, and to draw down upon the wretch the well-merited indignation of the virtuous and the happy. I was not long in hesitation, Being naturally quick, I committed to memory the entire tragedy of Metamora. I had the good fortune to recollect that in the accentuation of this drama, or at least of such portion of it as is allotted to the hero, the tones of voice in which I found myself deficient were altogether unnecessary, and that the deep guttural was expected to reign monotonously throughout. I practiced for some time by the borders of a well frequented by a well by the borders of a well frequented marsh. Herein, however, having no reference to a similar proceeding of Demosthenes, but from a design peculiarly and conscientiously my own, thus armed at all points, I determined to make my wife believe that I was suddenly smitten with a passion for the stage. In this I succeeded to a miracle, and to every question or suggestion found myself at liberty to reply in my most frog-like and sepulchral tones with some passage from the tragedy, any portion of which, as I soon took great pleasure in observing, would apply equally well to any particular subject. It is not to be supposed, however, that in the delivery of such passages I was found at all deficient in the looking asquint, the showing my teeth, the working my knees, the shuffling my feet, or in any of those unmentionable graces which are now justly considered the characteristics of a popular performer. To be sure, they spoke of confining me in a straitjacket, but good God, they never suspected me of having lost my breath. Having at length put my affairs in order, I took my seat very early one morning in the mail stage for blank, giving it to be understood among my acquaintances that business of the last importance required my immediate personal attendance in that city. The coach was crammed to repletion, but in the uncertain twilight the features of my companions could not be distinguished. Without making any effectual resistance, I suffered myself to be placed between two gentlemen of colossal dimensions, while a third of a size larger, requesting pardon for the liberty he was about to take, threw himself upon my body at full length, and falling asleep in an instant, drowned all my guttural ejaculations for relief in a snore which would have put to blush the roarings of the bull of Phalaris. Happily, the state of my respiratory faculties rendered suffocation an accident entirely out re- rendered suffocation an accident entirely out of the question. As, however, the day broke more distinctly in our approach to the outskirts of the city, my tormentor, arising and adjusting his shirt collar, thanked me in a very friendly manner for my civility. Seeing that I remained motionless, all my limbs were dislocated, and my head twisted on one side, his apprehensions began to be excited, and arousing the rest of the passengers, he communicated in a very decided manner his opinion that a dead man had been palmed upon them during the night for a living and responsible fellow traveler, here giving me a thump on the right eye by way of demonstrating the truth of his suggestion. Hereupon all, one after another, there were 9 in company, believed it their duty to pull me by the ear. A young practicing physician, too, having applied a pocket mirror to my mouth, and found me without breath, the assertion of my persecutor was pronounced a true bill, and the whole party expressed a determination to endure tamely no such impositions for the future, and to proceed no farther with any such carcasses for the present. I was here, accordingly, thrown out at the sign of the Crow, by which tavern the coach happened to be passing, without meeting with any farther accident than the breaking of both my arms under the left hind wheel of the vehicle. I must besides do the driver the justice to state that he did not forget to throw after me the largest of my trunks, which, unfortunately falling on my head, fractured my skull in a manner at once interesting and extraordinary. The landlord of the Crow, who is a hospitable man, finding that my trunk contained sufficient to indemnify him for any little trouble he might take in my behalf, sent forthwith for a surgeon of his acquaintance, and delivered me to his care with a bill and receipt for $10. The purchaser took me to his apartments and commenced operations immediately. Having cut off my ears, however, he discovered no signs of animation. He now rang the bell and sent for a neighboring apothecary with whom to consult in the emergency. In case of his suspicions with regard to my existence proving ultimately correct, he, in the meantime, made an incision in my stomach and removed several of my viscera for private dissection. The apothecary had an idea that I was actually dead. This idea I endeavored to confute, kicking and plunging with all my might, and making the most furious contortions, for the operations of the surgeon had, in a measure, restored me to the possession of my faculties. All, however, was attributed to the effects of a new galvanic battery, wherewith the apothecary, who is really a man of information, performed several curious experiments in which, from my personal share in their fulfillment, I could not help feeling deeply interested. It was a source of mortification to me, nevertheless, that although I made several attempts at conversation, My powers of speech were so entirely in abeyance that I could not even open my mouth, much less then make reply to some ingenious but fanciful theories of which, under other circumstances, my minute acquaintance with the Hippocratian pathology would have afforded me a ready confutation. Not being able to arrive at a conclusion, the practitioners remanded me for farther examination. I was taken up into a garret, and the surgeon's lady having accommodated me with drawers and stockings, the surgeon himself fastened my hands and tied up my jaws with a pocket handkerchief, then bolted the door on the outside as he hurried to his dinner, leaving me alone to silence and to meditation. Ah! I now discovered, to my extreme delight, that I could have spoken had not my mouth been tied up by the pocket handkerchief. Consoling myself with this reflection, I was mentally repeating some passages of the omnipresence of the deity, as is my custom before resigning myself to sleep, when two cats of a greedy and vituperative turn, entering at a hole in the wall, leaped with a flourish a la Catalani, and alighting opposite one another on my visage, but took themselves to indecorous contention for the paltry consideration of my nose. Bleh! But as the loss of his ears proved the means of elevating to the throne of Cyrus the Magian or Maigush of Persia, and as the cutting off his nose gave Zopyrus possession of Babylon, so the loss of a few ounces of my countenance proved the salvation of my body. Aroused by the pain and burning with indignation, I burst at a single effort the fastenings and the bandage. Stalking across the room, I cast a glance of contempt at the belligerents, and throwing open the sash to their extreme horror and disappointment, precipitated myself very dexterously from the window. The male robber W, to whom I bore a singular resemblance, was at this moment passing from the city jail to the scaffold erected for his execution in the suburbs. His extreme infirmity and long-continued ill health had obtained him the privilege of remaining unmanacled. And habited in his gallows costume, one very similar to my own, he lay at full length in the bottom of the hangman's cart, which happened to be under the windows of the surgeon at the moment of my precipitation, without any other guard than the driver, who was asleep, and two recruits of the Sixth Infantry, who were drunk. As ill luck would have it, I lit upon my feet within the vehicle. W, who was an acute fellow, perceived his opportunity. Leaping up immediately, he bolted out behind, and turning down an alley, was out of sight in the twinkling of an eye. The recruits, aroused by the bustle, could not exactly comprehend the merits the merits of the transaction. Seeing, however, a man, the precise counterpart of the felon, standing upright in the cart before their eyes, they were of opinion that the rascal, meaning W, was after making his escape. So they expressed themselves, and having communicated this opinion to one another, they took each a dram, and then knocked me down with the butt ends of their muskets. He's just not having a good day. It was long ere we arrived at the place of destination. Of course, nothing could be said in my defense. Hanging was my inevitable fate. I resigned myself thereto with a feeling half stupid, half acrimonious. Being little of a cynic, I had all the sentiments of a dog. The hangman, however, adjusted the noose about my neck. The drop fell. I forbear to depict my sensations upon the gallows, although here, undoubtedly, I could speak to the point, and it is a topic upon which nothing has been well said. In fact, to write upon such a theme, it is necessary to have been hanged. Every author should confine himself to matters of experience. Thus Mark Antony composed a treatise upon getting drunk. I may just mention, however, that die I did not. Yes, Yoda. My body was, but I had no breath to be, suspended. And but for the knot under my left ear, which had the feel of a military stock, I dare say that I should have experienced very little inconvenience. As for the jerk given to my neck upon the falling of the drop, it merely proved a corrective to the twist afforded me by the fat gentleman in the coach. All right, luck's turning around. For good reasons, however. I did my best to give the crowd the worth of their trouble. My convulsions were said to be extraordinary. My spasms it would have been difficult to beat. The populace encored. Several gentlemen swooned, and a multitude of ladies were carried home in hysterics. Pinxet availed himself of the opportunity to retouch, from a sketch taken upon the spot, his admirable painting of the Marsyas flayed alive. When I had afforded sufficient amusement, it was thought proper to remove my body from the gallows. This the more especially as the real culprit had in the meantime been retaken and recognized, a fact which I was so unlucky as not to know. Much sympathy was, of course, exercised in my behalf, and as no one made claim to my corpse, it was ordered that I should be interred in a public vault. Here, after due interval, I was deposited. The sexton departed, and I was left alone. A line of Marston's malcontent, "Death's a good fellow and keeps open house," struck me at that moment as a palpable lie. I knocked off, however, the lid of my coffin and stepped out. The place was dreadfully dreary and damp, and I became troubled with ennui. By way of amusement, I felt my way among the numerous coffins ranged in order around. I lifted them down, one by one, and breaking open their lids, busied myself in speculations about the mortality within. "This," I soliloquized, tumbling over a carcass, puffy, bloated, and rotund, "this has been, no doubt, in every sense of the word, an unhappy, an unfortunate man. It has been his terrible lot not to walk, but to waddle, to pass through life not like a human being, but like an elephant, not like a man, but like a rhinoceros. His attempts at getting on have been mere abortions, and his circumgyratory proceedings a palpable failure. Taking a step forward, it has been his misfortune to take 2 towards the right and 3 towards the left. His studies have been confined to the poetry of Crabbe. He can have had no idea of the wonder of a pirouette. To him, a pas de papillon, papillon I believe is butterfly. To him, but it's probably no butterfly. To him, a no butterfly has been an abstract conception. He has never ascended the summit of a hill. He has never viewed from any steeple the glories of a metropolis. Heat has been his mortal enemy. In the dog days, his days have been the days of a dog. Therein he has dreamed of flames and suffocation, of mountains upon mountains, of Pelion upon Ossa. He was short of breath. To say all in a word, he was short of breath. He thought it extravagant to play upon wind instruments. He was the inventor of self-moving fans, wind sails, and ventilators. He patronized DuPont, the bellows maker, and died miserably in attempting to smoke a cigar. His was a case in which I feel a deep interest, a lot in which I sincerely sympathize. But here, said I, here, and I dragged spitefully from its receptacle a gaunt, tall, and peculiar-looking form, whose remarkable appearance struck me with a sense of unwelcome familiarity. Here is a wretch entitled to no earthly commiseration. Thus saying, in order to obtain a more distinct view of my subject, I applied my thumb and forefinger to its nose, and causing it to assume a sitting position upon the ground, held it thus at the length of my arm while I continued my soliloquy. Entitled, I repeated, to no earthly commiseration. Who indeed would think of compassionating a shadow? Besides, has he not had his full share of the blessings of mortality? He was the originator of tall monuments, shot towers, lightning rods, Lombardy poplars. His treatise upon shades and shadows has immortalized him. He edited with distinguished ability the last edition of South on the Bones. He went early to college and studied pneumatics. He then came home, talked eternally, and played upon the French horn. He patronized the bagpipes. Captain Barclay, who walked against time, would not walk against him. Wyndham and Albrecht were his favorite writers. His favorite artist, Phiz. He died gloriously while inhaling gas. Levique flatu corripitor, like the fama, and this is going to be in Latin, and I don't know if it's going to translate it. Ah, excellent. He died gloriously while inhaling gas. A corrupter, a light breeze corrupter, like the report conjugal. In Hieronymus. And there's a star, so we'll check. And it's also in Latin. So we'll see how well that goes. To have something about feminine, pudicit, corrupter. Translate. Delicate matter for women assert his modesty as a beautiful flower, soon to cool even languishes with a slight breeze. Corrupter, powerful, and yes, makes perfect sense. He died gloriously while inhaling gas. Something. He was indubitably a... How can you? Interrupted the object of my animadversions. That's a great word. Gasping for breath and tearing off with a desperate exertion the bandage around its jaws. How can you, Mr. Lack-a-Breath, be so infernally cruel as to pinch me in that manner by the nose? Did you not see how they had fastened up my mouth? And you must know, if you know anything, how vast a superfluity of breath I have to dispose of. If you do not know, however, sit down and you shall see. In my situation, it is really a great relief to be able to open one's mouth, to be able to expatiate, to be able to communicate with a person like yourself, who do not think yourself called upon at every period to interrupt the thread of a gentleman's discourse. Interruptions are annoying and should undoubtedly be abolished. Don't you think so? No reply. I beg you. One person is enough to be speaking at a time. I shall be done by and by, and then you may begin. How the devil, sir, did you get into this place? Not a word, I beseech you. Been here some time myself. Terrible accident. Heard of it, I suppose. Awful calamity. Walking under your windows some short while ago, about the time you were stage struck. Horrible occurrence. Heard of catching one's breath, eh? Hold your tongue, I tell you. I caught somebody else's. Had always too much of my own. Met Blab at the corner of the street. Wouldn't give me a chance for a word. Couldn't get in a syllable edgeways. Attacked consequently with epilepsis. Blab made his escape. Damn all fools. They took me up for dead and put me in this place. Pretty doings, all of them. Heard all you said about me. Every word a lie. Horrible, wonderful, outrageous, hideous, incomprehensible, etc., 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 etc. It is impossible to conceive my astonishment at so unexpected a discourse, or the joy with which I became gradually convinced that the breath so fortunately caught by the gentleman, whom I soon recognized as my neighbor Windenough, was in fact the identical expiration mislaid by myself in the conversation with my wife. Time, place, and circumstance rendered it a matter beyond question. I did not, however, immediately release my hold upon Mr. W.'s proboscis, not at least during the long period in which the inventor of Lombardy poplars continued to favor me with his explanations. In this respect, I was actuated by that habitual prudence which has ever been my predominating trait. I reflected that many difficulties might still lie in the path of my preservation, which only extreme exertion on my part would be able to surmount. Many persons, I considered, are prone to estimate commodities in their possession, however valueless to the then proprietor, however troublesome or distressing, in direct ratio with the advantages to be derived by others from their attainment, or by themselves from their abandonment. Might not this be the case with Mr. Windenough? In displaying anxiety for the breath of which he was at present so willing to get rid, might I not lay myself open to the exactions of his avarice? There are scoundrels in this world, I remembered with a sigh, who will not scruple to take unfair opportunities with even a next-door neighbor. And this remark is from Epictetus. It is precisely at that time when men are most anxious to throw off the burden of their own calamities that they feel the least desirous of relieving them in others. Upon considerations similar to these, and still retaining my grasp upon the nose of Mr. W., I accordingly thought proper to model my reply. Monster, I began in a tone of the deepest indignation. Monster and double-winded idiot, dost thou, whom for thine iniquities it has pleased heaven to accurse with a twofold respiration, dost thou, I say, presume to address me in the familiar language of an old acquaintance? I lie, forsooth, and hold my tongue, to be sure, pretty conversation indeed to a gentleman with a single breath. All this, too, when I have it in my power to relieve the calamity under which thou dost so justly suffer, to curtail the superfluities of thine unhappy respiration. Like Brutus, I paused for a reply, with which, like a tornado, Mr. Windenough immediately overwhelmed me. Protestation followed upon protestation, and apology upon apology. There were no terms with which he was unwilling to comply, and there were none of which I failed to take the fullest advantage. Preliminaries being at length arranged, my acquaintance delivered me the respiration, for which, having carefully examined it, I gave him afterwards a receipt. I am aware that by many I shall be held to blame for speaking, in a manner so cursory, of a transaction so impalpable. It will be thought that I should have entered more minutely into the details of an occurrence by which, and this is very true, much new light might be thrown upon a highly interesting branch of physical philosophy. To all this I am sorry that I cannot reply. A hint is the only answer which I am permitted to make. There were circumstances, but I think it much safer upon consideration to say as little as possible about an affair so delicate. So delicate, I repeat, and at the time involving the interests of a third party, whose sulphurous resentment I have not the least desire, at this moment, of incurring. We were not long after this necessary arrangement in effecting an escape from the dungeons of the sepulchre. The united strength of our resuscitated voices was soon sufficiently apparent. Scissors, the Whig editor, republished a treatise upon the nature and origin of subterranean noises. A reply, rejoinder, confutation, and justification followed in the columns of a Democratic Gazette. It was not until the opening of the vault to decide the controversy that the appearance of Mr. Windenough and myself proved both parties to have been decidedly in the wrong. I cannot conclude these details of some very singular passages in a life at all times sufficiently eventful, without again recalling to the attention of the reader the merits of that indiscriminate philosophy which is a sure and ready shield against those shafts of calamity which can neither be seen, felt, nor fully understood. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, among the ancient Hebrews, it was believed the gates of heaven would be inevitably opened to that sinner or saint who, with good lungs and implicit confidence, should vociferate the word Amen. It was in the spirit of this wisdom that, when a great plague raged at Athens, and every means had been in vain attempted for its removal, Epimenides, as Laertius relates in his second book of that philosopher, advised the erection of a shrine and temple to the proper god. Littleton Berry. All right, that went a different direction than I was thinking it was going to. Thought it was going to be a little bit more of his humorous ones, which it was. It was quite funny. I thought. Also, again, a little dark, little gory, which I'm absolutely fine with. Just was not ready for it. But it was. It was good. It was a pleasant surprise, if you can call it that. It's not too strange to do. But yes, and then I love his, how he, like the wind enough and lack of breath, how that goes with the rest of the theme of the story. Very good, very good. So this one, that was loss of breath, loss of breath. Yeah, something like that. And this final one, potential final one, probably, yes. The landscape garden. There was another one I was going to do, but that I actually really wanted to do, but there's a significant accent in it that I'm not sure I would be able to bungle through. Alas, we shall probably end on this one. So this is the landscape garden, and as I was reading, I believe it was actually a first draft, if you will, of his later story, The Domain of Arnheim, which was very lovely. So it's probably going to be much similar, but I guess it's probably kind of a decent way to end the year-long Poe run, because it's just not just going to be, but I assume going to be very beautiful, very lovely, and just a nice breath, sigh, ending on a nice sort of thing. So, the landscape garden. The garden like a lady fair was cut, that lay as if she slumbered in delight, and to the open skies her eyes did shut, the azure fields of heaven were assembled right, in a large round set, with the flowers of light. The flowers deluce, and the round sparks of dew that hung upon their azure leaves, did show like twinkling stars that sparkle in the evening blue. Giles Fletcher, beautiful. Oh no! No more remarkable man ever lived than my friend, the young Ellison. He was remarkable in the entire and continuous profusion of good gifts ever lavished upon him by fortune. Take a quick drink. Much reading already done. Little more left to do. So I'll actually just quick start over. No more remarkable man ever lived than my friend, the young Ellison. He was remarkable in the entire and continuous profusion of good gifts ever lavished upon him by fortune. From his cradle to his grave, a gale of the blandest prosperity bore him along. Nor do I use the word prosperity in its mere worldly or external sense. I mean it as synonymous with happiness. The person of whom I speak seemed born for the purpose of foreshadowing the wild doctrines of the Turgot, Price, Priestley, and Condorcet, of exemplifying by individual instance what has been deemed the mere chimera of the perfectionists. In the brief existence of Ellison, I fancy that I have seen refuted the dogma that in man's physical and spiritual nature lies some hidden principle, the antagonist of bliss. An intimate and anxious examination of his career has taught me to understand that, in general, from the violation of a few simple laws of humanity, arises the wretchedness of mankind. That, as a species, we have in our possession the as yet unwrought elements of content, and that even now, in the present blindness and darkness of all idea on the great question of the social condition, it is not impossible that man, the individual, under certain unusual and highly fortuitous conditions, may be happy. With opinions such as these was my young friend fully imbued, and thus it is especially worthy of observation that the uninterrupted enjoyment which distinguished his life was in great part the result of preconcert. It is indeed evident that with less of the instinct of philosophy which now and then stands so well in the stead of experience, Mr. Ellison would have found himself precipitated by the very extraordinary successes of his life into the common vortex of unhappiness which yawns for those of preeminent endowments. But it is by no means my present object to pen an essay on happiness. The ideas of my friend may be summed up in a few words. He admitted but four unvarying laws, or rather elementary principles, of bliss. That which he considered chief was, strange to say, the simple and purely physical one of free exercise in the open air. The health, he said, attainable by other means than this is scarcely worth the name. He pointed to the tillers of the earth, the only people who, as a class, are proverbially more happy than others, and then he instanced the high ecstasies of the fox hunter. His second principle was the love of woman. His third was the contempt of ambition. His fourth was an object of unceasing pursuit, and he held that, other things being equal, the extent of happiness was proportioned to the spirituality of this object. I do remember this. I have said that Ellison was remarkable in the continuous profusion of good gifts lavished upon him by fortune. In personal grace and beauty, he exceeded all men. His intellect was of that order to which the attainment of knowledge is less a labor than a necessity and an intuition. His family was one of the most illustrious of the empire. His bride was the loveliest and most devoted of women. His possessions had been always ample, but upon the attainment of his 21st year, it was discovered that one of those extraordinary freaks of fate had been played in his behalf, which startle the whole social world amid which they occur, and seldom fail radically to alter the entire moral constitution of those who are their objects. It appears that about 100 years prior to Mr. Ellison's attainment of his majority, there had died, in a remote province, one Mr. Seabright Ellison. This gentleman had amassed a princely fortune, and having no very immediate connections, conceived the whim of suffering his wealth to accumulate for a century after his decease. Minutely and sagaciously directing the various modes of investment, he bequeathed the aggregate amount to the nearest of blood bearing the name Ellison, who should be alive at the end of the 100 years. Many futile attempts had been made to set aside this singular bequest. Their ex post facto character rendered them abortive, but the attention of a jealous government was aroused, and a decree finally obtained forbidding all similar accumulations. This act did not prevent young Ellison, upon his 21st birthday, from the entering into possession as the heir of his ancestor Seabright of a fortune of $450 millions. An incident similar in outline to the one here imagined occurred not very long ago in England. The name of the fortunate heir, who still lives, is Thelison. I first saw an account of this matter in the tour of Prince Puckler Moscow. He makes the sum received 90 millions of pounds, and observes with much force that, in the contemplation of so vast a sum, and of the services to which it might be applied, there is something even of the sublime. To suit the views of this article, I have followed the prince's statement. A grossly exaggerated one, no doubt. All right, back to the story. $450 million. When it had become definitely known that such was the enormous wealth inherited, there were, of course, many speculations as to the mode of its disposal. The gigantic magnitude and the immediately available nature of the sum dazzled and bewildered all who thought upon the topic. The possessor of any appreciable amount of money might have been imagined to perform any one of 1,000 things. Much reading has been done. With riches merely surpassing those of any citizen, it would have been easy to suppose him engaging to supreme excess in the fashionable extravagances of his time, or busying himself with political intrigues, or aiming at ministerial power, or purchasing increase of nobility, or devising gorgeous architectural piles, or collecting large specimens of virtue, or playing the munificent patron of letters and art, or endowing and bestowing his name upon extensive institutions of charity. But for the inconceivable wealth and the actual possession of the young heir, these objects and all ordinary objects were felt to be inadequate. Recourse was had to figures, and figures but sufficed to confound. It was seen that, even at 3%, the annual income of the inheritance amounted to no less than $13,500,000, which was $1,125,000 per month, or $36,986 per day, or $1,541 per hour, or $6.20 for every minute that flew. Thus the usual track of supposition was thoroughly broken up. Men knew not what to imagine. There were some who even conceived that Mr. Ellison would divest himself forthwith of at least 2/3 of his fortune as of utterly superfluous opulence, enriching whole troops of his relatives by division of his superabundance. I was not surprised, however, to perceive that he had long made up his mind upon a topic which had occasioned so much of a discussion to his friends. Nor was I greatly astonished at the nature of his decision. In the widest and noblest sense, he was a poet. He comprehended, moreover, the true character, the august aims, the supreme majesty and dignity of the poetic sentiment. The proper gratification of the sentiment he instinctively felt to lie in the creation of novel forms of beauty. Some peculiarities, either in his early education or in the nature of his intellect, had tinged with what is termed materialism the whole cast of his ethical speculations, and it was this bias, perhaps, which imperceptibly led him to perceive that the most advantageous, if not the sole legitimate field for the exercise of the poetic sentiment, was to be found in the creation of novel moods of purely physical loveliness. Thus it happened that he became neither musician nor poet, if we use this latter term in its everyday acceptation. Or it might have been that he became neither the one nor the other, in pursuance of an idea of his which I have already mentioned, the idea that in the contempt of ambition lay one of the essential principles of happiness on earth. Is it not indeed possible that while a high order of genius is necessarily ambitious, the highest is invariably above that which is termed ambition? And may it not thus happen that many far greater than Milton have contentedly remained mute and inglorious? I believe that the world has never yet seen, and that, unless through some series of accidents goading the noblest order of mind into distasteful exertion, the world will never behold that full extent of triumphant execution in the richer productions of art of which the human nature is absolutely capable. Mr. Allan became neither musician nor poet, although no man lived more profoundly enamored both of music and the muse. Under other circumstances than those which invested him, it is not impossible that he would have become a painter. The field of sculpture, although in its nature rigidly poetical, was too limited in its extent and in its consequences to have occupied at any time much of his attention. And I have now mentioned all the provinces in which even the most liberal understanding of the poetic sentiment has declared this sentiment capable of expatiating. I mean the most liberal public or recognized conception of the idea involved in the phrase poetic sentiment. But Mr. Allan imagined that the richest, and altogether the most natural, and most suitable province had been blindly neglected. No definition had spoken of the landscape gardener, as of the poet, yet my friend could not fail to perceive that the creation of the landscape garden offered to the true muse the most magnificent of opportunities. Here was, indeed, the fairest field for the display of invention, or imagination, in the endless combining of forms of novel beauty, the elements which should enter into combination being, at all times, and by a vast superiority, the most glorious which the earth could afford. In the multiform of the tree and in the multicolor of the flower, he recognized the most direct and the most energetic efforts of nature at physical loveliness. And in the direction or concentration of this effort, or still more properly, in its adaptation to the eyes which were to behold it upon earth, he perceived that he should be employing the best means, laboring to the greatest advantage in the fulfillment of his destiny as poet. Its adaptation to the eyes which were to behold it upon earth. In his explanation of this phraseology, Mr. Allan did much towards solving what has always seemed to me an enigma. I mean the fact, which none but the ignorant dispute, that no such combinations of scenery exist in nature as the painter of genius has in his power to produce. No such paradises are to be found in reality as have glowed upon the canvas of Claude. In the most enchanting of natural landscapes there will always be found a defect or an excess, many excesses and defects. While the component parts may exceed, individually, the highest skill of the artist, the arrangement of the parts will always be susceptible of improvement. I like that. Come back! And I remember this from the other one, so it must have been in the domain of Arnheim, just more fully fleshed out. So yes, the parts, and see, that's interesting too, that this saying the parts exceed the whole, where a lot of times it's usually the whole that tends to exceed the parts. In short, no position can be attained from which an artistical eye, looking steadily, will not find matter of offense, in what is technically termed the composition of a natural landscape, and yet how unintelligible is this. In all other matters we are justly instructed to regard nature as supreme. With her details we shrink from competition. Who shall presume to imitate the colors of the tulip, or to improve the proportions of the lily of the valley? The criticism which says of sculpture or of portraiture that nature is to be exalted rather than imitated is in error. No pictorial or sculptural combinations of points of human loveliness do more than approach the living and breathing human beauty as it gladdens our daily path. Byron, who often erred not in saying, I've seen more living beauty, ripe and real, than all the nonsense of their stone ideal. In landscape alone is the principle of the critic true, and having felt its truth here, it is but the headlong spirit of generalization which has induced him to pronounce it true throughout all the domains of art. Having, I say, felt its truth here. For the feeling is no affectation or chimera. The mathematics afford no more absolute demonstrations than the sentiment of his art yields to the artist. He not only believes, but positively knows that such and such apparently arbitrary arrangements of matter or form constitute and alone constitute the true beauty. Yet his reasons have not yet been matured into expression. It remains for a more profound analysis than the world has yet seen, fully to investigate and express them. Nevertheless, is he confirmed in his instinctive opinions by the concurrence of all his compeers. Let a composition be defective, let an emendation be wrought in its mere arrangement of form. Let this emendation be submitted to every artist in the world, by each will its necessity be admitted. And even far more than this, in remedy of the defective composition, each insulated member of the fraternity will suggest the identical emendation. I repeat that in landscape arrangements or collocations alone is the physical nature susceptible of exaltation, and that therefore her susceptibility of improvement at this one point was a mystery which hitherto I had been unable to solve. It was Mr. Ellison who first suggested the idea that what we regarded as improvement or exaltation of the natural beauty was really such as respected only the mortal or human point of view, that each alteration or disturbance of the primitive scenery might possibly affect a blemish in the picture, if we could suppose this picture viewed at large from some remote point in the heavens. It is easily understood, says Mr. Ellison, that what might improve a closely scrutinized detail might at the same time injure a general and more distantly observed effect. He spoke upon this topic with warmth, regarding not so much its immediate or obvious importance, which is little, as the character of the conclusions to which it might lead, or of the collateral propositions which it might serve to corroborate or sustain. Actually going to highlight this just a little bit, just to come back to it either once I'm done or just on my own. We'll see. We'll just go back. He spoke upon this topic with warmth, regarding not so much its immediate or obvious importance, which is little, as the character of the conclusions to which it might lead, or of the collateral propositions which it might serve to corroborate or sustain. There might be a class of beings, human once, but now to humanity invisible, for whose scrutiny and for whose refined appreciation of the beautiful, more especially than for our own, had been set in order by God the great landscape garden of the whole earth. In the course of our discussion, my young friend took occasion to quote some passages from a writer who has been supposed to have well treated this theme. There are properly, he writes, but two styles of landscape gardening, the natural and the artificial. One seeks to recall the original beauty of the country by adapting its means to the surrounding scenery, cultivating trees in harmony with the hills or plain of the neighboring land, detecting and bringing into practice those nice relations of size, proportion, and color which, hid from the common observer, are revealed everywhere to the experienced student of nature. The result of the natural style of gardening is seen rather in the absence of all defects and incongruities, in the prevalence of a beautiful harmony and order, than in the creation of any special wonders or miracles. The artificial style has as many varieties as there are different tastes to gratify. It has a certain general relation to the various styles of building. There are the stately avenues and retirements of Versailles, Italian terraces, and a various mixed Old English style, which bears some relation to the domestic Gothic or English Elizabethan architecture. Whatever may be said against the abuses of the artificial landscape gardening, a mixture of pure art in a garden scene adds to it a great beauty. This is partly pleasing to the eye by the show of order and design, and partly moral. A terrace with an old moss-covered balustrade calls up at once to the eye the fair forms that have passed there in other days. The slightest exhibition of art is an evidence of care and human interest. From what I have already observed, said Mr. Ellison, you will understand that I reject the idea, here expressed, of recalling the original beauty of the country. The original beauty is never so great as that which may be introduced. Of course, much depends upon the selection of a spot with capabilities. What is said in respect to the detecting and bringing into practice those nice relations of size, proportion, and color is a mere vagueness of speech which may mean much or little or nothing, and which guides in no degree. that the true result of the natural style of gardening is seen rather in the absence of all defects and incongruities than in the creation of any special wonders or miracles, is a proposition better suited to the groveling apprehension of the herd than to the fervid dreams of the man of genius. The merit suggested is, at best, negative, and appertains to that hobbling criticism which, in letters, would elevate Addison into apotheosis. In truth, while that merit which consists in the mere avoiding demerit appeals directly to the understanding and can thus be foreshadowed in rule, the loftier merit, which breathes and flames in invention or creation, can be apprehended solely in its results. Rule applies but to the excellences of avoidance, to the virtues which deny or refrain. Beyond these, the critical art can but suggest. We may be instructed to build an Odyssey, but it is in vain that we are told how to conceive a tempest, an inferno, a Prometheus bound, a nightingale, such as that of Keats, or the sensitive plant of Shelley. But the thing done, the wonder accomplished, and the capacity for apprehension becomes universal. The sophists of the negative school, who, through inability to create, have scoffed at creation, are now found the loudest in applause. What, in its chrysalis condition of principle, affronted their demure reason, never fails, in its maturity of accomplishment, to extort admiration from their instinct of the beautiful or of the sublime. Our author's observations on the artificial style of gardening, continued Mr. Ellison, are less objectionable. A mixture of pure art in a garden scene adds to it a great beauty. This is just, and the reference to the sense of human interest is equally so. I repeat that the principle here expressed is incontrovertible, but there may be something even beyond it. There may be an object in full keeping with the principle suggested, an object unattainable by the means ordinarily in possession of mankind, yet which, if attained, would lend a charm to the landscape garden immeasurably surpassing that which a merely human interest could bestow. The true poet, possessed of very unusual pecuniary resources, might possibly, while retaining the necessary idea of art or interest or culture, so imbue his designs at once with extent and novelty of beauty as to convey the sentiment of spiritual interference. It will be seen that, in bringing about such results, he secures all the advantages of interest or design, while relieving his work of all the harshness and technicality of art. In the most rugged of wildernesses, in the most savage of the scenes of pure nature, there is apparent the art of a creator. Yet is this art apparent only to the reflection? In no respect has it the obvious force of a feeling. Now, if we imagine this sense of the Almighty design to be harmonized in a measurable degree, if we suppose a landscape whose combined strangeness, vastness, definitiveness, and magnificence shall inspire the idea of culture, or care, or superintendence, on the part of intelligences superior yet akin to humanity, then the sentiment of interest is preserved, while the art is made to assume the air of an intermediate or secondary nature, a nature which is not God, nor an emanation of God, but which still is nature in the sense that it is the handiwork of the angels that hover between man and God. It was in devoting his gigantic wealth to the practical embodiment of a vision such as this, in the free exercise in the open air, which resulted from personal direction of his plans, in the continuous and unceasing object which these plans afforded, in the high spirituality of the object itself, in the contempt of ambition which it enabled him more to feel than to affect, and lastly, it was in the companionship and sympathy of a devoted wife that Ellison thought to find, and found, an exemption from the ordinary cares of humanity, with a far greater amount of positive happiness than ever glowed in the rapt daydreams of de Style. So I believe the domain of Arnheim actually went on to um, describe what he ended up creating, which is what I was assuming it was going to go into. It did stick with just the philosophy of it, which again that's something that I've really enjoyed with Poe, is that philosophy that he really tacks on to the beginning and then goes into the more fiction-based narrative of it. And it reminded me of a book or a series that I read recently, which was it was a science fiction one, fully science fiction, and one of the themes or one of the ideas that it presented was a two-dimensional person on a target, and if somebody shoots a line into the target and there's a two-dimensional person on it and they follow the holes, they might think that pattern would go on forever, but it doesn't. But they can't see that because they're not from that outer perspective. Same with turkeys every day of the year. They get fed days and days and days and days. Then on Thanksgiving, they're all like, all right, we're going to get some food. And something else happens instead. So, yeah, there's order or perceived order where there's not actually, but then also looking at details, if you zoom in too close, you might not see the order that is. There might seem chaotic, but there is an order to it looking at it from afar. So it's all about perspective and external and dimensions and, oh yes, all good things, all good things. So yes, that was Edgar Allan Poe. A little over a year of Edgar Allan Poe. Some of the things I did skip over because like essays and criticisms, even if they were satirical criticisms, I wasn't necessarily sure I wanted to do on here just because it doesn't, again, lend itself that well to this medium. But yeah, it was so much fun. I was surprised every single time I read him because it was at the beginning I kind of did. I just had that idea of him as being macabre and gruesome. And I mean, there was that, and it was beautiful and wonderful and excellent and consistently surprising. But it was also philosophical, it was humorous, it was satirical. And there was, again, a lot of beautiful depictions, descriptions as well. So yes, it was very, it blew me away. I wasn't expecting it. I was expecting to enjoy it, but not even as much as I did. And I'm very happy that I did and decide to do it. And I'm glad I could share it with whoever might have enjoyed it as well. So yes, so now, so this is why I actually got into doing Poe, is that I wanted to watch this movie that is apparently murders, so fictional movie. So, well, obviously, somebody starts murdering, like serial killer based on the works of Poe, and so I wanted to make sure I read all those, and so I was like, well, I might as well like read all of them, and so that's why I started this here, and there it is, and yes, and I guess we are done now. So next, I got suggested that to do the Sonnets of Shakespeare, which I'm very much looking forward to. It's a little daunting just because I haven't done Shakespeare in a while, so it'll be like getting back into, my Shakespearean will be a little bit rusty, I assume, but I have my nice big book of Shakespeare that I will have handy, and yeah, we'll try to analyze them and translate them, and it'll be a good time, and I get to put on my theatricality a little bit, which is going to be fun. I hope for everyone else too. It's going to be great for me, but yes. So yes, that was, I'll see if I can remember all of the names of them. So it was The Landscape Garden, Loss of Breath, and the one before that. Oh, the balloon one. Malenta Tauta. And then yes, I did consider doing another one, The Angel of the Odd, but I don't think that I would be able to affect we'll go look at it. But yes, so I'll just go to, oh mein Gott, denn what a fool you be for that. Yeah, no, that's just not gonna work. So yes, no. Yeah. So anyway, yes, that was Poe. At some point, I'll get to Shakespeare. I won't be able to stream anymore this week. So next week at some point. And yes, we'll do some flying. We'll do more reading of Shakespeare. Start reading Shakespeare. And hopefully I'll get into a proper schedule to also get back to watching some Buster Keaton and potentially other games. So yeah, we'll see. It's right now the flight stuff is my life. So that's what I'm focusing on. But I do want to at least keep up with the reading because that is my main thing. So anyway, Yeah. So to whoever got lost and found their way here, found their way back, thank you very much. I had a great time. I hope you did too. And yeah, have a. Did I already say have a great whatever it's gonna be for you? Well, have it twice if I did. And yeah, hope to see you again soon. Thank you and bye.